The alternative was not one of the famous tiaras photographed at state banquets or displayed in royal exhibitions. It had spent years outside the public conversation, surrounded by uncertainty, family memories, and one uncomfortable question: why had a jewel with such powerful connections been allowed to disappear almost completely? That question was exactly what pulled the bride toward it. The piece belonged to an older chapter of royal history, one that had crossed generations without ever becoming permanently tied to a single modern royal woman. Unlike the jewels instantly recognized by the public, this one had somehow slipped between eras. It had been inherited, discussed, preserved, and then quietly pushed into the background. Inside the palace, there had always been an unofficial hierarchy surrounding jewelry. Some pieces carried power because everyone knew them. Their names, previous wearers, and famous appearances had become part of royal mythology. But another category existed beneath that surface: jewels whose importance came from how little was publicly understood about them. The bride became fascinated by those pieces, and this particular jewel had one detail that made it impossible to ignore. Years earlier, it had been connected to a royal woman whose position within the family became increasingly complicated. As relationships shifted and loyalties hardened, the jewel seemed to disappear with that chapter. Later generations rarely revived it. Nobody offered one simple explanation. Some claimed it had become too fragile for regular use. Others believed changing fashion made it unsuitable. There were suggestions that personal wishes had kept it locked away, but there was also the possibility nobody wanted to discuss openly, that its disappearance had been deliberate, because wearing it again would revive questions the family preferred to leave unanswered. Princess Anne, however, seemed to know more. The younger generation may have seen the jewel as a forgotten object, but Anne had lived through enough of the family's history to understand exactly what certain possessions represented. That knowledge became important when the bride did something advisors had not expected. She asked to see the piece privately. When it was finally presented to her, the difference was immediate. Anne's familiar tiara represented recognizable continuity, a safe connection between generations. This forgotten piece carried something far more unsettling. It represented interrupted inheritance, a story that had begun, been pushed aside, and never received the ending it appeared destined to have. The bride understood the message almost immediately. If she chose Anne's tiara, the wedding would signal tradition and acceptance. If she chose this one, it would say something entirely different. It would take an abandoned chapter and place it back inside the royal story. That possibility worried advisors. The jewel could encourage questions about its former owner, its disappearance, and why nobody had worn it for so long. The bride was not ready to say yes. But, more importantly, she would not say no. That refusal created the first real problem. Because the deeper advisors investigated the jewel's history, the clearer it became that Princess Anne was not simply connected to the expected tiara, she was connected to the secret behind its rival as well. Princess Anne had spent a lifetime understanding one brutal royal rule: not every family truth benefits from being explained. She rarely sentimentalized jewelry in public. But when she learned which forgotten piece the bride was considering, her reaction reportedly changed, not because she wanted to stop her, but because she knew exactly what the choice would reopen. Anne had spent decades surrounded by objects that carried far more than their official descriptions suggested. A tiara could be listed as diamonds, silver, and family inheritance, but inside royal life, those details were only the surface. Certain pieces became tied to marriages, disappointments, rivalries, promises, and people who were no longer there to explain what they had once meant. Anne understood that better than most. That was why her own expected tiara seemed like the obvious choice. It represented stability. It was familiar, respected, and free from the kind of questions that could pull attention away from the bride herself. Wearing it would send a simple message: continuity, family approval, and acceptance into a tradition that had survived generations. The forgotten jewel carried the opposite feeling. Anne had encountered it years earlier during private discussions surrounding older royal pieces. She had known where it came from, who had once been associated with it, and why its history remained sensitive. Yet she had never tried to claim it for herself. That was not because she lacked interest. Anne understood that sometimes wearing a jewel could revive comparisons nobody wanted reopened. A single appearance could bring an old relationship back into public discussion, revive questions about inheritance, or force one generation to explain decisions made by another. So Anne had often chosen restraint. She knew when symbolism could overpower the person wearing it, and she had spent years quietly respecting those boundaries. That was why advisors watched her closely when they told her the bride was seriously considering the forgotten piece. Anne did not object. She did not demand that her own tiara be used. She simply became quiet. Some around her interpreted that silence as disappointment. But privately, Anne's concern was reportedly much more complicated. She wanted to know whether the bride understood what she was taking on. Because, as Anne allegedly made clear, a royal jewel never belongs only to the person wearing it. It carries everyone who touched its story before. That could mean affection. It could mean loyalty. But it could also mean grief, rivalry, expectation, and unfinished memory. For the bride, that changed everything. She had expected Anne to become the woman whose tiara she might reject. Instead, Anne seemed to be the only senior royal refusing to pressure her at all. And strangely, that made the decision harder. Choosing Anne's tiara now felt like accepting something offered with genuine family warmth. Choosing the forgotten jewel meant turning toward a more complicated story, one that felt closer to the bride's own desire to define her place rather than inherit it fully formed. She was no longer choosing between two beautiful pieces. She was choosing between two different futures. But the decision would soon become larger than Anne or the bride, because another senior figure discovered what was being considered, and suddenly the forgotten tiara was no longer a private jewelry choice, but a palace problem. The moment senior palace advisors understood that the bride was serious, the mood changed. What had begun as a private discussion about wedding jewelry became an argument about precedent, headlines, hierarchy, and control. Nobody officially forbade the piece, but suddenly every practical reason imaginable appeared for why she should not wear it. At first, the objections sounded reasonable. The jewel might require restoration. Its fitting could be difficult. Insurance would need to be checked. Its history had to be confirmed. There were concerns about whether it suited the ceremony, whether it would photograph well, and whether bringing it back after so many years might create unnecessary attention. But one concern became 5. 5 became 10. Soon, the bride began to understand what was really happening. She had permission, but not encouragement. That was how the palace often worked when it wanted to avoid giving a direct order. Nobody needed to say no. Instead, obstacles could be placed around a decision until the person making it became exhausted enough to choose the safer option. And the safer option was always waiting. Princess Anne's tiara was repeatedly mentioned as the elegant solution. It was respected, family approved, historically uncomplicated, and unlikely to turn the wedding into a debate about old royal wounds. Choosing it would remove almost every problem advisors claimed to be facing. Yet the more they pushed Anne's tiara forward, the more suspicious the bride became. Why did one forgotten jewel make everyone so nervous? Then, something was found. During preparations, An old private record connected to the piece reportedly suggested that its future had once been imagined very differently. At one point, the jewel may have been expected to continue through another branch of the family, passing along a line that was later interrupted. That discovery changed the argument completely. Now the jewel was no longer simply forgotten. It had been passed over. And if the bride wore it, even without saying a word, she could appear to restore a path of inheritance that had quietly disappeared. That possibility deeply concerned the palace. Royal watchers would ask who had once been meant to receive it. They would ask why that transfer never happened. And inevitably, they would begin discussing who had been favored, who had been overlooked, and whether certain family decisions had been more political than anyone admitted. The tension finally surfaced during a private family conversation when a senior figure reportedly suggested that the bride should simply leave history where it is. The words were meant to end the argument. Instead, they gave the bride a reason to continue it, because if history truly meant nothing, why did everyone seem so determined to keep it buried? From that moment, the pressure only strengthened her resolve. She began to see the forgotten piece not as a problem to avoid, but as proof that something unfinished still existed beneath the polished surface of royal tradition. Through all of this, Anne remained remarkably measured. She did not campaign for her own tiara. She did not join those warning against the alternative. She simply watched. And her neutrality began to feel less like distance and more like quiet permission. And then Anne finally spoke to the bride directly, without advisors, without ceremony, and without telling her which tiara to choose, and what she said would change the meaning of the wedding completely. The bride may have expected Princess Anne to defend the tiara everyone believed she would lend. Instead, Anne reportedly offered something far more unsettling, a warning about what happens when a royal woman wears a symbol chosen to please everyone except herself. There was no command. That made the message even harder to ignore. For the first time, the pressure surrounding the wedding seemed to fall away. No advisors, no carefully worded objections, no discussion about headlines, precedent, or what the palace thought would look safest. Anne made one thing clear almost immediately. If the bride rejected her tiara, she would not take it personally. That alone changed the atmosphere. Anne understood that royal weddings had a strange way of turning personal choices into permanent identities. A tiara worn for only a few hours could follow a woman for decades. People would compare her to whoever had worn it before. They would search for hidden messages, inherited loyalties, and signs of approval. What began as jewelry could become a label. Anne had lived long enough inside the monarchy to know how powerful that could be. In royal life, jewels often said what people could not. They could suggest closeness, distance, trust, rank, memory, even quiet disagreement. And once the public attached a meaning to a piece, it was almost impossible to separate the wearer from that story. So Anne gave the bride a simple warning: do not choose something only because everyone else expects it. But she did not make the alternative sound easy. The forgotten jewel carried its own burden. Wearing it would invite questions. People would ask why it disappeared, who once expected to inherit it, and why it had remained untouched for so long. Anne wanted the bride to understand that choosing freedom did not mean escaping consequences. That was when the bride realized something important. Anne was not protecting herself. She was protecting the bride from making a decision she might spend years regretting. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Anne's tiara represented acceptance into a structure that already existed. The forgotten piece represented something riskier. The chance to create a new branch of the story rather than simply step into an old one. Then the bride asked the question that had been waiting beneath everything else. Why had Anne never worn the forgotten jewel herself? Anne did not give a full answer. She simply suggested that she had her reasons, and those reasons belonged to another time. That answer made the silence around the piece feel even heavier. For the first time, the bride began to wonder whether Anne had avoided it deliberately. Perhaps she had understood that some jewels should not be claimed simply because they were available. Perhaps leaving it untouched had preserved the possibility that, one day, another woman could choose it without feeling that she was taking something away. By the end of the conversation, the bride was no longer afraid of offending Anne. Now, she feared something else entirely, giving up her own choice simply because the palace was uncomfortable with it. By the following morning, the argument was effectively over. The bride had made her decision, but almost nobody outside a tiny circle knew that the tiara everyone expected had already been returned. Hours before the ceremony, the palace was still operating under the assumption that tradition had won. Then came the quiet confirmation. Princess Anne's tiara would not be used. The bride had chosen the forgotten piece instead, and suddenly an object hidden for years was about to appear before millions with no explanation. By that point, there was almost no room left for hesitation. The fittings had been completed. Final preparations were underway. Public speculation had already settled around Anne's tiara as the most likely choice, and inside the palace, many had expected the matter to end exactly that way. But it did not. The expected piece was formally removed from the wedding plan, and the forgotten jewel took its place. That decision immediately created a new problem. The palace now had to protect the secret long enough to prevent the choice from leaking before the ceremony. Staff who had worked around the original plan were forced to adjust quickly, while the jewel itself was prepared with unusual care and discretion. Yet the practical changes were only part of the tension. There was also the question of what the palace would say. If the choice became public, should it be explained as aesthetic, sentimental, historical, personal? Each answer carried risks, because none of them fully addressed the complicated family story attached to the piece. And nobody seemed eager to tell that story. The bride reportedly rejected the idea of creating an elaborate explanation in advance. She did not want the jewel surrounded by carefully managed language before she had even worn it. Her decision was simple. Let the piece appear first. Let people react afterward. Anne, meanwhile, received confirmation with remarkable calm. There was no confrontation, no wounded objection, no attempt to make the bride reconsider. That reaction frustrated anyone who had expected the situation to become a family dispute. Without Anne's anger, there was no emotional pressure powerful enough to force the bride back toward the safer choice. In fact, Anne's quiet acceptance may have made the decision almost impossible to stop. Others were less comfortable. Some were curious. Some worried the choice would be interpreted as a challenge. Others understood that royal watchers would immediately begin asking why this particular jewel had returned after so long. Then, with the ceremony approaching, the bride faced one final moment of doubt. Until now, the forgotten piece had belonged to private history. The moment she wore it publicly, that would change forever. It would be photographed, studied, compared, and connected to her name. Whatever silence had protected its past would disappear. She understood the weight of that. And she chose it anyway. Because the real shock was never simply that Anne's tiara had been rejected. It was that a buried chapter of royal history had been deliberately brought back at the most public moment possible. And the instant the bride appeared, the questions began not because the tiara was unfamiliar, but because those who recognized it understood that its return could not possibly be meaningless. At first, many viewers simply saw a beautiful royal bride wearing an unexpected jewel. But inside the palace, And among those who knew the collection, the reaction was completely different. The forgotten tiara had returned in the most public way possible, instantly forcing people to ask why it vanished and why this bride brought it back. Almost immediately, the predictions surrounding Princess Anne's tiara began to collapse. Royal observers who had spent days expecting one familiar piece suddenly found themselves looking for answers. Old photographs were compared, past appearances were searched, family connections were traced. The wedding had barely unfolded, yet the jewel was already beginning to create a story of its own. At first, the simplest explanation was also the most dramatic. Had the bride rejected Anne? That theory spread quickly, because it fit the tension people expected. But Anne's reaction made the idea difficult to sustain. She showed no public sign of offense, no attempt to distance herself, and no suggestion that something personal had been taken from her. That changed the direction of the questions. If this was not a rejection of Anne, then why had the forgotten piece been chosen at all? Attention turned toward its history. Older connections began resurfacing, including the uncomfortable possibility that the jewel had once been expected to continue through a different branch of the family. Suddenly, people were no longer asking only who had worn it before. They wanted to know who had been meant to wear it next, why that path had changed, and whether the piece had disappeared because its history became too difficult to explain. The palace offered very little, and that silence only made everything louder. Because silence inside royal life can become more powerful than denial. The less the institution explains, the more people begin to fill the gaps themselves. Every missing detail starts to feel deliberate. Every unanswered question begins to look like evidence that something larger is being protected. Anne became central to that mystery. Her refusal to claim insult transformed the bride's decision. What first looked like rebellion began to feel more like a choice Anne quietly understood better than anyone else. The jewel now carried a meaning far beyond the ceremony. It represented a woman entering the monarchy while refusing to let expectation define every part of her identity. But it also exposed something more uncomfortable. Royal jewelry was never just about beauty. Pieces could be assigned, withheld, passed down, delayed, or quietly removed from public life, all while carrying loyalties that nobody wanted to discuss openly. What had been intended as a wedding accessory had become something closer to a piece of unfinished family history. And once the public recognized that, the palace could no longer make the old questions disappear. Yet the greatest consequence did not appear on the wedding day at all, because after the ceremony the tiara returned behind palace doors and a new question emerged: who would be allowed to wear it next? The photographs lasted longer than the ceremony. From that day forward, the forgotten tiara could never return to obscurity in quite the same way. The bride had not merely selected a jewel. She had restored a broken chapter of royal memory and forced the family to confront who truly decides what gets remembered. From that moment on, the piece carried her name with it. A jewel that had once existed in the shadows of the royal collection was now tied to one of the most important days of her life. That connection could not simply be undone. Every future mention of the tiara would now lead back to the bride who chose it when almost everyone expected something safer. Princess Anne's tiara did not lose its importance. If anything, its absence became part of the story. It was no longer the piece that had been rejected in anger. It became the symbol of the path that had been offered but not taken. And that difference mattered. The wedding quietly changed the way royal jewelry could be understood. A piece with a complicated history no longer had to remain hidden forever. Sometimes bringing an old jewel back could be less about reopening wounds and more about giving unfinished history another meaning. That challenged one of the monarchy's most comfortable ideas, that inheritance always moves neatly from one woman to the next. In reality, royal objects rarely travel so simply. They are inherited, offered, withheld, delayed, reassigned, protected, and sometimes left untouched for years. In that sense, the tiara became a perfect symbol of royal identity itself. Much can be inherited. Much can be decided by tradition. But occasionally, someone chooses differently. Anne became one of the most surprising figures in that story. Her refusal to interfere may have been the very thing that allowed the bride to make an independent choice. Years later, some inside the palace could still disagree over whether Anne had anticipated that decision from the beginning. And one question remained unresolved. Why had Anne never worn the forgotten tiara herself? Perhaps the answer was practical. Perhaps it belonged to a private memory she never intended to explain. Or perhaps Anne understood something more powerful, that the jewel was waiting for a moment that did not belong to her generation. If so, the bride did more than revive it. She completed a story Anne had deliberately left open. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of everything that happened. By refusing the tiara everyone expected, the bride may not have rejected Anne at all. She may have followed Anne's deepest lesson about surviving royal life, respect tradition, but never allow expectation to erase identity. And that leads to the final twist. The real mystery was never why the bride rejected Princess Anne's tiara. It was why the palace had worked so hard to make everyone forget the one she chose instead. And perhaps that is why the jewel still carries such fascination, because inside the royal family, the most revealing objects are rarely the ones displayed most proudly. They are the ones hidden away until someone finally decides that the old rules no longer deserve the final word.